Another video. Today I'm super excited to be going through a full beginner's app build with you. Today we're going to be building a to-do list app with Swift and Xcode for iOS. So with that being said, let's jump right in by starting up Xcode. So we're going to be building this in Swift, like I said. Let's open up Xcode once we have it up here. Endless Simulator. Let's create a new project. And we can do that by hitting Command-Shift-N. And once Xcode decides to load, which sometimes it takes a second or two, we're going to select a single view application. We're going to give it a name of let's call it tasks actually, instead of to-do list. Let's save it wherever we'd like. And I'm going to basically be going through this step by step. We're going to create an app in which we can show, enter to-do list entries, show them when the person closes the app and comes back, those entries are still there. And they can, of course, go into an entry and delete it quite simply. And I'm also going to show how we're going to lay the foundation if we want to add more functionality, like set a due date to it, and set up reminders and things like that. Cool. So we're going to explain every step along the way. So let's get into it by expanding our Xcode window to give ourselves some more room to work. And first and foremost, what we need to do is we need to go to our main storyboard and we need to set up our interface in here. So we're going to essentially be using two view controllers, one which is this one that's already given to us, and a second one where we're going to display more information about a task that we've entered once we click on it. We also want to show a list of tasks here. So to do that, we're going to use a table view. So because we need these elements, let's start by dragging them in and adding constraints to them to lay them out. So to do that, we're going to hit this button up here, which will give us our library of elements. Let's search for a table view, drag this in, and once you see it on your view controller, we're going to come down here and hit this button, and this button will allow us to add constraints. So we're going to add 0, 0, 0, 0, which will pin this once we hit enter to every side of the screen. Then what we want to do is we want to add in one more view controller, and we can simply search view controller. And notice there's a couple in here, but we just want this basic view controller. So this will actually give us another screen similar to the one you see on the left. And once we create a task and click on it, we want to show this screen. And the other thing we want to do is we're going to click on this, and we're going to come up here and go to editor, and then we're going to go to embed in, and we're going to select navigation controller. And when we do that, you'll see that this extra window thing popped up that says navigation controller, and there's an arrow from it to our main view controller. And what a navigation controller is essentially the skeleton in which you can put more view controllers. So if you open up the settings app on your iPhone, and I'll actually show you through Google Images. Well, let's do the navigation controller is actually the functionality of this bar up here where you can show a title and some actions, and when you click into something, you know that there's like the animation where we get like this back button and you can swipe it back. That functionality is actually all built in for us right into the navigation controller, which is what we're going to be using to navigate between the lists of tasks and the task information that we display on this view controller. Next, we need to go to our view controller itself, which was auto-generated for us with this template. Apple gives us one by default, and we want to do a couple things in here. The first thing we want to do is we want to create an outlet for our table view. And this outlet basically lets us control the table view on the storyboard that we just added by connecting this variable to it. Another thing we need to do is implement the TableView delegate and data source, which supplies the data and handles interactions with the cells on the table view. And we're going to do that with extensions. So we're going to do extension, view controller, delegate, and we can copy and paste this real fast. to do data source. In this implementation, we want to handle taps on a cell, which is going to be did select row at index path. Once we've selected a row, we want to unselect it. In other words, get rid of the highlight color that pops up. So we're going to say TableView, deselect the row at this index path, and the animation will say true. This index path comes in from this function, as you can see, which is basically the position in the table of where that row is. We have an error down here because there are two required functions that we must implement for the data source, and those are the number of rows as well as the cell for the actual row. So we're going to do those in just a second here. Before we do that, what we want to do is let's go back to our storyboard and do a couple more things on here. So we see we have this table. We created an outlet, so we need to right-click this view controller and drag from this connection outlet on this table view that we added to our actual table view, and you can see it highlights in blue because we can connect it. And once we let it go, you'll see that there is this connection from this table view variable to our actual table view itself. We also need to add a prototype cell to our table view, which is more or less a template cell that we can reuse over and over to display information, which in this case will be our title of the task that we as a user are adding. So if you click on the table view, come up here, open the side inspector. This prototype cell you can see is set to 0. Let's click this and make it 1. Once we've added a prototype cell, we need to give it an identifier. So select it on the left, come up here and give it an identifier. So I think I didn't select it. Yeah, so let's open this up, select the table view cell, come up here and give it an identifier, and let's call it just cell and make our life simple. If you have multiple prototype cells, which I've gone over in another video, in this case it's a little irrelevant for the breadth of knowledge you need around it, but if you do have multiple table view cells, the identifiers do need to be unique. Next, we can go back to our view controller. What we can do here is we can say we need to create an array, and this array is going to hold all the tasks that the user has entered thus far, which is going to be an array of strings. We're going to implement the two functions that it's yelling at us to do here. So the first one is number of rows, and we want to return the number of things in our task array that we put up here. So obviously when we start and create the task array, first and foremost it'll be empty. So in this view did load, what we need to do is get all current saved tasks, which we'll fill out in just a moment. Excuse me. The second thing we need to do is actually return the cell for the given row, and we're going to do that in a function called cell for row at index path. And what we need to do in here is we need to dequeue a cell, which is something that a lot of people find a little confusing. Dequeuing a cell more or less just means using the template over and over to get an instance of a cell, and then we're going to configure the cell, which means we're going to supply the data into a cell. So when you open up like the settings app, every cell has an icon and a text label. The cell itself is the same, reused over and over, with the text label and the icon being swapped out. In our case, we're just going to swap out the text of the actual task we want to display. So we're going to do that by saying let cell equals tableview.dequeue cell, and we want to select this first one, which is dequeuing a cell with an identifier, which is cell, which is the one we gave in our storyboard, and for index path. At the end here, we want to return the cell in this function because this function requires a cell to be returned to it. In between here, what we want to do is we want to say the cell's text label, and its text is going to be the text in that position in the tasks array. Tasks array. And this index path.row represents the position of the cell in our table view. So if we're at the first position, we want the first task. And this function will only be called for as many cells that are in here. So there will never be a situation where these two functions are out of sync in terms of count. If we return the task count in here, which is initially 0, because this is empty, we won't call this function and return anything because there's nothing to return. Cool, so let's actually run this app and see what we have so far. What I expect is we're going to have an empty table view with no cells, nothing on it, because we don't have any tasks yet. The next thing we're going to be doing is writing the components to actually add a task and show it, or add a task and save it rather into our application. So we see we have this table view here, and you can see that with the lines. Well, I don't know if it's visible, but anyways, we're going to add a plus button up here. And to do that, we can simply do it in the storyboard actually. So what we can do up here is come to here, this library, search for a bar button item. We can drag it up here. Let's give it a title of add. Let's go back to our view controller. And let's create an IB action, which is going to handle once we clicked on that button. We're going to call it did tap add. Once the user taps add, we want to do something. In this case, we're going to show another view controller to make an entry. So we're going to actually need another view controller. So initially I mentioned we needed 2. We have 3 here because one is a navigation, but I said we needed 2 because one is going to show a list of tasks. One is going to display task information and options to delete it. And the third one we're going to add is going to be the one where we actually make the entry for our task. So let's find a view controller, drag it on here, and go back to this. What we need to do is, because we have this class for a view controller with all the code for this particular one that shows a list of tasks, we need to create 2 more view controllers, one to show information about a task and the other one to actually enter a task. So what you want to do is right click this folder, hit new file, hit enter. We're going to create a Cocoa Touch class, make sure this is Swift, make sure this is UI view controller, and the first one we're going to create is entry view controller. As the name implies, this is where we're going to actually enter in our task, so we can go ahead and firstly delete this commented code that we give us, that Xcode gives us. Right click it again, new file one more time, Cocoa Touch class, and we're going to call this next one task view controller, where we're going to actually display info about the given task. Delete this once more. Now let's go to the entry view controller. In here, what we want to do is have a field where the user can enter in a task and a done button function, which once they click it, will save it. So we're going to say IB Outlet, and it's going to be a var field text field. We're going to set a delegate on the field. Basically, once the person hits the enter key in the keyboard, will also prompt the app to save whatever is entered if anything is entered. So by having this delegate, we can come up here and say UI text field delegate. What we can also then say is should return, which is the function called once the person hits the return key on the keyboard. And we're going to call a function here called save task, which we haven't created yet. Let's create this. And what we need to do now is in our storyboard, connect this new view controller. So this is yelling at us because we've said the field delegate, but we haven't said itself. But we need to connect this view controller, this code, to an actual view controller. So you saw that we dragged out another view controller here. What we need to actually do is click on one of them, one of the new ones, come up here, and in this tab, give it the class that is associated with it. So this one is entry. The other thing we need to do is give it a storyboard ID, which is the ID we're going to use to actually show the view controller. The next thing we want to do is do the same for this guy. We're going to give it the task view controller identifier that we created. and give it a task. Okay, cool. So now let's go back to our normal view controller, the very first one. Ignore my antivirus pop-up. In this function, we're going to instantiate that view controller with the ID we just created, the entry view controller. So we're going to say VC equals storyboard instantiate. If I can spell instantiate today. We want instantiate view controller with identifier. And we can say as entry view controller. Now that we have our entry view controller here, we're going to give it a title and we're going to present it onto the screen. And the way we do that is we're going to say vc.title and we're going to say new task. And because this main view controller we embedded inside of a navigation controller, we can say navigation controller push view controller and give it the view controller we want to push, animated true. So let's run this really fast. Go to our simulator, and we'll see that once we hit this add button, and once this decides to move out of the way, we'll get the add view controller. And the reason we're not getting it is because I forgot to connect this function to our button. So if we come back here, click on this view controller, right click, we'll see we have this function here that we created. We want to connect this to this button. What I'll also say is come into here and give this entry view controller a different background color so we can actually see it in action. So we can give it a black color for now. Let's run it one more time, and we'll see that once we select this add button, we actually crash. So why do we crash? So we crash because we created a field in here in our entry view controller and we did not create it in our storyboard. So similar to you guys, I'm not going to edit these little like gotchas out. It's very common to have these little gotchas and it's totally okay as long as you understand what you missed and go and add it. So we're going to come here, we're going to find a UI text field. We're going to drag it onto our screen. This is going to put a field onto our screen that we're going to enter the task in. We're going to add some constraints to it. So we're going to say 20 from the top, 20 from the right, 20 from the left and right. And the height itself, we're going to give it 52. Enter. Let's right click this up here and let's drag field to this. Run it one more time, and hopefully we didn't miss anything this time. Come up here and we can hit this add button, and just like that, we have this screen pop up, which is awesome. The next thing you want to do is add another button up here to hit called save to actually tap to save our task. So let's do a couple things. Let's go back to our view controller and give this view controller a title as well. So we want to say self.title tasks. We actually forgot to do one thing with our table view in here. We specified this data source and delegate, but we never connected it in terms of saying our table views delegate is self and our table views data source is self. We're going to then go to our entry view controller. What we're going to say in here is we want to create a button at the top right, which has the word save on it. So you saw we dragged on a button here to add. I showed you how to do it in here. We're going to actually also do one programmatically so you understand that you can do it both ways. So go back to entry view controller, and we're going to say navigation item dot right bar button equals UI bar button item. And we're going to initialize it with a title. We're going to call it save. The style can be done. The target is self, which is where the function resides that we're going to call. And we want an action function. We're going to call it, and we want a selector in here actually. A selector is basically just a way to reference a function in this class that we want to call once the actual button is clicked. And we already have this here, so we're going to paste this in here. We can actually get rid of the IB action because we're not connecting this in the interface builder or storyboard. We also want to put at Objective-C here or at objc, and that actually allows this function to be used as a selector. In here, what we want to do is actually save our content of the field. So we're going to say, rather, we want to first make sure that the field isn't empty. So we're going to say guard field.text, or we can say rather guard let text equals field.text, and text is empty. Rather, text is not empty. So we're saying we want to make sure that there is text in this field. If there is, it'll come into this variable. And we want to make sure the text, we're checking if it's empty and the inverse of it. So we're checking if it's not empty. If any of these cases match, we don't want to continue. We're just going to return. But once we pass this guard statement, we basically want to save our task. So how are we going to save? To save tasks in this app, we're going to be using UserDefaults. UserDefaults is a pretty lightweight mechanism built into iOS to save pretty simple things. It's by no means a full-fledged database, which is a little more advanced and a little more involved to set up. But what we're going to save is two things essentially. We're going to save a count of how many tasks we have so far, and we're also going to save each task with a given number. So the first time the app loads up, nothing is saved. So actually we want to come to our view controller and we want to set up the initial saving mechanism. And let's call this setup. What we want to do is we're going to say user defaults dot bool for key. We're going to say if this isn't set up, in other words, if this is false, we want to set up some initial defaults. So by default, we have 0 tasks. So we want to save 0. So we're going to say user defaults set we want to set first and foremost a bool for this setup because we want to only come into here once. So once we've set up on the first launch, we won't ever come into here again. And we also want to say set a value for a key, and that value is going to be a 0. And basically, let's see if we can actually pass in the direct 0, which I believe we can, yeah. So we're going to say set 0 for key, and it's going to be count, which is going to be the number of tasks that we currently have. So now we can go back to our entry view controller. When we want to save this, what we want to go ahead and do is get our count, increment the number by 1, so we can say we have more things in our table view or in our tasks now. And we also want to save the task that we entered, which is in this variable called text. So the first thing we want to do is get our count, which is user defaults value for key. We called it count, and it's going to be an int. And we should get a warning in just a second, yep, because we haven't actually used this variable. And that's what the second warning is here. It's also initializing as an immutable value, but it was never used yet. Basically, this warning is just saying that we created this but never used it. Just as an FYI, if you guys get concerned of what these warnings are on the side. The next thing we want to do is actually change this to a var because we want to increment this. So let's say new count is count plus 1. Then we want to set this new count again. So we're going to say set new count for count. And lastly, we want to actually save our tasks. And the way we're going to save it, and let's see, why is this complaining? This is saying we can't add 1 to this because it's an optional. So what we can do is we can say guard let count equals this, otherwise return. So the reason it's giving us this error, or it was just a second ago, it'll go away, is because when we try to get this count, it might come back as nothing because Swift isn't aware that we've already set this up in the other view controller. So we have to just explicitly guard against it being nil, in other words, being empty. So that's all that warning means. Anyways, so now we've updated our count here, and the last thing we need to do is actually save our task. And the way we're going to do that is we're just going to call this again, except the thing we're saving is text, and the actual key we're going to use to save it is going to be task underscore our new count. So that each key, every time we save this new task, will be unique, and that's how we're going to save. The last thing we want to do is a little confusing to wrap your head around. Well, the concept is pretty simple, but the actual implementation is a little confusing. But what we want to do is we want to not only remove this screen, but we want to update the table view on this previous screen. And to update it, what we're going to do is we're going to pass in a reference of a function to this particular view controller. So what that means is we're going to create a variable up here. Let's call it update. And the type of this variable is going to be void, returning void, and I believe this needs to go into parentheses like so. And what this does essentially, and this is complaining because, oh, I guess we don't need these actually, just kidding. So what this actually does, actually we don't even need that at all. I believe we can just do this. As Swift has evolved, these languages have gotten very, very shorthanded. So if the warning, the compiler gives you warnings, it's always interesting to read them and see what has changed. But once we go back to view controller, where we created this entry view controller, this let VC instantiate with identifier, what we can do is we can actually say vc.update equals something. This update is a function that we've created, and every time we call this function in that view controller, we want to reload this table view, and actually we want to refetch the tasks that are saved. So we're going to create a function called update tasks. When we first load the app in view did load, we're going to call this to actually update our tasks, and we're also going to call this once we call this update function from our entry view controller, because we then want to reload this table view. This is complaining that we need to add self in front of it because it explicitly tells this curly brace block that we want to call this function in this class. The other thing we want to do, which I won't get too far into, is actually put this function inside of a dispatch. It doesn't want to pop up. Main async, and I don't think I spelled it correctly. Sorry, give me 1 second. So this is those moments that I also won't edit out where the actual naming people forget. So what we're gonna do is open up Safari here. We're gonna quickly go to Google, and we're gonna search Swift dispatch main, and we'll get a bunch of links here. Let's click on this first one. So it's very common that people forget these naming conventions, which is totally cool. Yeah, this is what we want. So it's totally cool to look it up. Don't ever feel like you're the only one looking it up. You saw myself in this video, I'm looking it up. But basically we want to do this. It's dispatch queue main async, right? So what this basically says is we want to make sure that we prioritize updating the actual tasks, in other words, calling this function. That's all this block means. I can get into the nitty-gritty of it in terms of threading, but I won't for the sake of this being a beginner video. Anyways, moving along, we want to come back to our entry view controller and wrap this up. And we're going to wrap this up by calling this update function that we've added. And actually this question mark goes before this because this is an optional. So we're going to say update question mark with the parentheses, which is basically saying if this update function exists, let's call it. And once we've called it, let's dismiss this view controller. We're going to say navigation controller, pop to root view controller. Animated yes. So let's go back to our view controller and let's fill out this function so when we run it, we can actually see our new tasks coming in here. So we have this variable up here called tasks, which is an array of strings. What we want to do is, first and foremost, get our count in here. And similar to how we did it in the entry view controller, we want to say it's an int. And we also want to make it a guardlet because it could be an optional. And for x, rather we can do is, let's think, for x in 0, ... to count, which basically says we want to create a for loop, which is going to iterate. Let's see, do we have an error? Yes, we do have an error because we forgot a dot. What we are basically saying is we want to iterate through 0 up until this count, inclusive of this count. And the reason we want to do that is because we're going to get each of our tasks and add it to our task array. And the way we do that is by saying let task equal UserDefaults, value for key, and the key, like you remember we added, was task underscore, in this case x, because x is the current position we're going to start at. And actually what we want to do, because we start out as 0 and never actually use 0, because we add 1 to it every time we add, we're going to say we're going to do x plus 1. And we're going to say, well, this is 0 up until this count, because we're adding 1 to it. And once we have our task, we're going to say actually guardlet to make sure it's not empty. Let's actually do an iflet. So we're saying if this, this task that we're trying to pull out isn't empty, we will be adding it to our tasks array. And we want to make sure this task is a string when it comes back, so we're going to add a as string up here, which will get rid of this warning in just a second, like so. So we've gone over a lot, so let's run this, and I will definitely do a recap at the very end. So right now, if we run this app, we'll see we have our title up here, this empty table view. Let's come here and type in a task. So let's do get milk. Let's hit this button. And when we come back, we're not seeing our actual task, which is not good. So let's actually take care of why we're not seeing our actual task. The reason we're not seeing our task is because we do refetch this. We do recreate this task array, but we actually forgot to do two things. Every time we go and try to recreate this task array, before we update it, we want to say tasks remove all, which removes all the elements in this task array so we don't show duplicates. And we also want to reload our table view. And we can do that by saying TableView.reload data. So if we run this one more time, we'll see we have get milk here because the last time we did it, we actually did save it to the actual device. And the first time the app opens and this view did load runs, we call this update and we fixed our implementation in here so we can actually get it now, which is pretty awesome. So let's try another one. Let's try to add clean office. Hit this, and look at that, we have clean office. So this is a pretty simple to-do list app, and what we want to quickly add as the last piece of this app is being able to tap on one of these and to show another screen with a delete button. So similar to how we have this guard let to show the VC, we're going to copy this code actually, and we're going to create another function. Actually, we can just do it in here. So in the delegate function, what I want you to do is copy that code, and we're going to say let VC, and we're going to use the identifier as task. The view controller will be task view controller. And if you recall, we created this in the storyboard. We're going to get rid of this update nonsense because that doesn't exist on this view controller. We're going to go to our task view controller, and we're going to do a couple things. We're going to create an IB outlet for a label. We're going to create a task, which is a string optional. We're going to say the label.text equals task. We're going to say that we want to have a function which is delete task. We're going to add a navigation item similar to the entry controller. And a title we're going to give it as delete. It's going to be done, self, and the selector is going to be delete. The other thing we're going to say in here is the stuff that needs to go into this function. Basically what we're going to do, and maybe I'll leave it out specifically for the purposes of this video, but because we have saved these tasks with numbers, so every time we save it, we increment it, so task 1, 2, 3, etc., and more or less infinite until we run out of space on our device, which will probably get you into like the tens of trillions of tasks. What we want to do is we can go into our user defaults and we can say basically set value, and what we want to do is we want to set two values. One value is the new count that we're going to create. For count, we want to decrement the count of tasks that we have because we're removing one. So for this, which I'll probably stub out right now and not fully finish because it's a little out of scope, we want to get the original count and just do -1. And what we also want to do is we want to actually set nil for the count of the current task. So whatever the task's current position is. And the thing that is a big gotcha for a lot of people is when you're removing a task. So looking at this, when you're removing a task, let's say you have like 10 entries here and you remove one from the middle, you need to shift all of the numbers for the tasks below it, because when you go to list out these tasks in your table view, you're going to have an empty number in the middle. So if we have task 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, let's add them actually really fast to exemplify this better. If we have all these tasks, when we delete this one, because this is task 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, we're left with 1, 2, 4, and 5. So what we want to do is all the tasks that are below 3 or above 3, quote unquote, we want to shift them down one position. So it turns out to be 1, 2, 3, 4. If we don't do that, we're going to have an empty entry. So because you can imagine doing that is a little more involved, I will omit it in this video. If enough people put it in the comments and request it, I can do a follow-up. But I'm going to comment this out for now. And we're going to go to our table view, or sorry, our storyboard. We're going to quickly add a label here. And then we're going to add some quick constraints to it. And those are going to be 12, 12, 12, and 12. And we're going to connect our outlet. You can also connect it this way instead of actually dragging it to the label here. And let's run this. And you'll see once we click on a task, we are taken to this view controller, and in this label, we don't have our task. And the reason we don't have our task is in the view controller, what we want to do is we want to say vc.task equals tasks and the index path row. So in the delegate function, every time we click it, we want to create this view controller and assign it a task. So let's try this one last time. Click on it, and awesome. We have our task show up right here. And that's all there is to it. So on this view controller, this is essentially where you can add a bunch of other functionality. So you can have a function where the person can set a reminder, a due date, a notification sound, notes about an event. You can imagine a calendar app is built very similarly with a lot of calendar and dates, calendar like functionality and dates involved. So I'll wrap this video up here. It's getting a bit long. Let's review really fast. So we actually started off on the storyboard. The storyboard has 4 things on it right now. The first being a navigation controller, in which this first list view controller, which is what I'm just calling it. That's not what it's actually called, technically speaking. But this view controller with the table view is. We have this view controller, which has our field to enter in new tasks. We also have this view controller to show task entries. We created 2 view controllers here, but let's start with just the basic view controller. This one has a table view and a task array of strings. We assign table view delegate and data source as well as a title. We create this initial setup block to make sure that we start off with a count of 0. We call this function every time we first start the app in this view controller to fetch, rather not fetch, but to update our tasks array from whatever we saved. That's what this function is doing. Then down here we have this function, which is called when we click on the add button at the top right of the screen. It's connected in the interface builder, which is a storyboard, which is why it has a prefix of IB action. Then we have the delegate function itself for the table view, which is what happens when we select a cell. We also have the data source functions, which supplies the number of rows, which is number of things in tasks, as well as a cell. In the entry view controller, we have a field outlet. We also have a function, which is called also a closure, called update, which is void, nothing returning void. We come in here and set the delegate on the field. We create a button for the person to tap done when they're done entering. We added a delegate function, which is once the person hits return on the keyboard, we'll also add their task if there's something in there by running that function. That function we created makes sure that we have text and it's not empty. It also makes sure that we have a count. It increments the count. It saves the new count as well as the task. It calls the update function if it exists, and it dismisses as view controller. Lastly, we have the task view controller. In here, I stubbed out this delete function to exemplify how this delete functionality would work. We have a label outlet, which we created. We have this task variable, which is a string optional, which we assign our task content to before we push this controller on screen. In view.load, we set the label as text to the task, and we also create this button, this delete button, and attach it to this function, which is all commented out because we didn't actually implement it for the sake of time. So yeah, that's a nice overview of a simple to-do list app. It may not be as simple as some of you had hoped or thought, but if you take a look at the code that we've written in here, it's very redundant. There's a lot of patterns you can identify. And once you kind of wrap your head around some of these concepts like table views and navigation controllers, it makes iOS development just open up to you, and it gives you endless possibilities for combinations of different screens and actions and just things you can do. So thank you so much for watching. If you liked the video, leave a like below. Subscribe if you're new. I regularly post iOS, Swift, development, other tech videos. Welcome to the channel, and I'll see you in the next video.